An unprecedented look at a decade in power now on BBC One. The key players give an insight of the tussles at the top in the start of our major news series, The Blair Years.
Tony Blair and Gordon Brown spent 10 years in Downing Street, in the two most important jobs in British politics. We were filming at number 10 on the day Blair finally handed over power to his old friend and rival. Tonight, the story of Blair's mission to change Britain and transform its public services, and how it was shaped by the complex relationship between the two men.
The relationship between myself and Gordon was a different type of political relationship than most between prime ministers and chancellors. That's true, and it's also true, I mean, the point in being silly about it, that there were tensions from time to time.
I think he became increasingly frustrated with the Chancellor and no doubt did think about what he might be able to do about that.
There were people at times who were saying to Tony, look, is it sensible to keep Gordon at the Treasury? Well, the answer to the question is, well, is it sensible to have him out of the Treasury?
You know, when you're Prime Minister, you're aware that other people may want to succeed you. And I always used to say to people, it's not an ignoble ambition. I mean, why shouldn't he want to be Prime Minister?
In the weeks before Tony Blair left office, and in the time since, he has given the BBC an unprecedented insight into his time in power. Blair agreed to a series of interviews with Times journalist David Aaronovitch to reflect on his time at number 10. Later episodes will tell the stories of Blair's war in Iraq and of his transformation from crowd pleaser to messianic leader. In his last days as Prime Minister, Blair was anxious to prove to the world that his legacy was a transformation of his country.
Because I was just saying to the governor, I mean, all the schools in the country are basically being either rebuilt completely or refurbished.
Very nice.
Blair spent an entire decade at number 10.
Yeah, I thought you were.
But as he prepared for Gordon Brown to take over, he was still concerned that his vision for Britain had not been understood.
My single principal motivating anxiety for the country is for us as a country to understand the scale and the intensity and the speed of change.
Blair was one of the most dominant figures in British political history, and yet for much of his time as Prime Minister, he couldn't get his way.
It's gonna be bad. Oh, it's my fault.
Though it was Blair who had grabbed the Labour leadership, Gordon Brown had always seen himself as the senior member of this extraordinary political partnership. When the two men led Labour to a general election landslide in 1997, Gordon Brown assumed it wouldn't be too long before he could take over from Blair as Prime Minister. Within a week of taking power, Tony and Gordon showed what they could achieve when they worked together. Within days, they made a bold political move. They took control of interest rates out of the hands of politicians and created an independent Bank of England.
What you had to do above all else was say to the British people, everything you have learnt, you know, from your mother's knee about the Labour Party and its capability or otherwise of governing, forget it. This is a party that can govern the country and in particular can run the economy well. That's why the Bank of England independence was of such, you know, momentous importance to me. What I didn't want with a decision as big as this, I didn't want any argy-bargy about it.
Britain's most senior civil servant was astonished that Blair and Brown didn't see the need even to consult the new cabinet on the biggest economic decision the new government was ever likely to make.
What I remember him saying to me is, they will all agree. And I said, but that's not really the point. I think that we have cabinet government in this country. This is a big decision. I think people outside may well ask and will expect that the decision has been taken by the cabinet.
If you'd had a cabinet discussion, everyone's sitting around and people had said, well, we think it's a bad idea, and that had come out, you would have, I think the government would have ended before it began. You know, obviously if Gordon had been against it, that would have been a different matter altogether, but he wasn't. He was absolutely for it. Myself and the Chancellor were absolutely on all fours together. Gordon and I talked about it very closely together. Gordon and I were fine about it. We just had to get it done.
I have therefore decided to give the Bank of England operational responsibility for setting interest rates with immediate effect.
Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were the inner cell of New Labour. That a lot of what they had done in bringing the Labour Party round to New Labour, they had done as an almost revolutionary cell. And that they weren't much in the business of consulting their colleagues in order to determine policies.
Brown thought he should be Prime Minister. He tolerated being number 2 because he had the prospect of taking over from Blair, and because he was given unprecedented influence on the government's policies for Britain. The government had not one head, but 2, and they didn't always see eye to eye. Just months after Blair and Brown took power, they clashed on welfare reform. Tony Blair had chosen maverick Labour MP Frank Field, a radical thinker on the benefit system, to be Minister for Welfare Reform. Field wanted fundamental changes.
I've described the system as one which works against the grain of human nature, which doesn't in any way adequately reward work, penalises savings, and encourages people not to tell the truth.
I love Frank. I think he's a great guy, and I really have got a lot of time for him, a lot of respect for him.
Blair started to explore if Field's vision to revitalise Britain's poor could be made to work. But Gordon Brown had very different ideas about how to go about tackling poverty.
The whole welfare reform programme hit the buffers very early on because it was thought that the ideas that I was promoting were very different from the ideas that Gordon Brown was promoting as Chancellor, and indeed they were. There was this extraordinary tension between the two of them. Gordon was adamant that nothing really was going to happen. And while the Prime Minister then, as he was incredibly gentle with the Chancellor, there was no give at all. And one just wondered, why do you put up with this? What is the relationship between the two of you that allows this to go on, and at what point are you going to sack him? And the Chancellor just glared from the other side of the table and sort of growled. And the Prime Minister then behaved as though he was looking after an adolescent son, you know, that it's going through a bad patch.
Only a year after Tony Blair gave Frank Field the job, he took it away. Gordon Brown's influence over welfare reform would remain. Blair and Brown were still willing to try to patch things up, and even put on a show of togetherness.
Well, I hope you guys do well. It's just going to be difficult, isn't it?
It looks natural, inviting the neighbour in to watch the football, but they're together in the Chancellor's Downing Street flat at a time of reported tension between them. They're eager, no doubt, to portray a picture of friendliness.
I don't think you'll find that any Chancellor and Prime Minister have worked more closely in this century.
Well, thank goodness it's only a game.
But in reality, the tensions at the heart of New Labour would only get more intense. Gordon Brown's tough spending plans had won him a reputation for prudence. But by the winter of 1999, the NHS was seriously short of cash.
We'd come in with a commitment that we would keep to the previous government's spending plans. So we put in some extra money into the health service, but not a very great deal. So there was a tight financial situation. I was receiving letters from people. There were heartbreaking letters about people waiting for their heart operation, you know, their husband or their relative and dying on a waiting list because they couldn't get treated quickly enough. Every winter, the pressures were such that they were just tipping the health service over.
It was hell on wheels. It was just unbelievable. I mean, the National Health Service was in the newspapers and at the top of the news continually.
Hospitals right across the United Kingdom are still struggling to cope with the flu outbreak. The Conservative leader William Hague said ministers should have seen the problem coming and claimed that bad planning was the real reason for the shortage of NHS beds.
You know, if you have people dying on trolleys, or if you have a case like the case of Mavis Skeet, the appalling case of somebody not being treated and all that flowed from that, of course it deserves to be in the newspapers.
Mavis Skeet had an urgent operation cancelled 4 times because of shortages.
Since early December, Mavis Skeet has been waiting for surgery to remove cancer from her throat.
My mum's a very, very strong person, but I think the 4th time of this happening has really knocked her back, and she just broke down into floods of tears.
I really came to the view that we needed a fundamental change of approach where we would really make the commitment on investment and in a way take away the excuse of money.
The crisis brought out the very different personal approaches of Blair and Brown.
By temperament, Tony was more of a cavalier, somebody who would carry the banner for change, charge for change, try and make it happen. And Gordon was a more considered, more of a roundhead Cromwellian figure in the way that he went about it in a very long-term, planned way. And so there was a difference of personality as well that was involved in the process.
Under pressure from the media, one morning Blair decided he would announce a sea change in health spending. He also decided not to seek permission from Gordon Brown first. In January 2000, Blair was booked to appear on Breakfast with Frost to talk about the NHS crisis. Under the Conservatives, Britain's spending on health had always lagged far behind the average in the rest of Europe. During his chat with Sir David Frost, he made a statement that sounded like the usual politician speak, but turned out to signal the biggest shift in health spending since the Second World War.
If we can carry on getting real-term rises in the health service of almost 5%, then at the end of that 5 years, we will be in a position where our health service spending comes up to the average of the European Union. It's too low at the moment.
That day, the government's most senior health advisors thought they had a Sunday off. But Blair had not thought to ask them to work out the detail of his announcement. Minutes after the Frost programme, number 10 hit the phones.
Pager goes off, number 10 on the line.
Around midday that day, the phone started to ring, and it virtually didn't stop ringing until about 9 o'clock at night.
Part of the issue here, of course, was that there was then this big faffing about to actually discover precisely what words Tony had used on Breakfast with Frost.
At the end of that 5 years, we will be in a position where our health service spending comes up to the average of the European Union.
And then this rather kind of Delphic construction as to what this actually meant had to be turned into something that was coherent and tangible.
The problem was, it was a Sunday, and most of the facts and figures were shut up in offices in Whitehall.
Luckily, my elder daughter's boyfriend had a quite sophisticated in those days a little calculator that had a compound interest function on it. I had the OECD data on the computer, and together we ran all sorts of different calculations.